The chamber of the Galactic Council had stood for 11,000 cycles. Carved from the heart of a dead star by hands that no longer existed, its walls held the accumulated gravity of every decision that had ever shaped the known galaxy. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, a dome of compressed dark matter that bent light into patterns too complex for most species to comprehend. At the center of the circular floor sat the Ascension Table, a flat disk of crystallized time, its surface shimmering with the ghosts of futures that had been discarded and histories that had been chosen. Today, for the first time in 400 cycles, every single delegation had sent its primary representative. No juniors, no proxies, no recorded messages delivered by embarrassed aides. They were all here physically present, sitting in the biologically calibrated seats that adjusted to accommodate forms ranging from the Vectheron's towering crystalline exoskeleton to the Ulun's gelatinous, perpetually shifting mass. The silence was the worst part. Counselor Tireth of the Sylphari sat perfectly still in her seat, her silver-threaded hair floating around her head as though suspended in water. Her species had evolved on a world where silence meant safety, where the slightest vibration could attract the attention of predators that burrowed through solid rock. She had not spoken in 3 standard hours, neither had anyone else. Around the table, the representatives of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy waited. They waited because the agenda item before them was not a treaty negotiation or a territorial dispute or a resource allocation debate. It was something far simpler and far more terrifying. It was a question. And the question was this: what do we do about humanity? The Ulun delegation shifted first, as they always did when the weight of uncertainty became too much for their chemically unstable neural networks to bear. Counselor Vex, a designation rather than a name, since the Ulun had long since abandoned individual identity in favor of collective efficiency, pulsed a deep violet as its membrane-like body expanded and contracted in a rhythm that indicated acute stress. The projections have been updated, Vex said, its voice translated by the chamber's universal matrix into something that sounded like a cello being played underwater. All 14,000 of them. No, Vex admitted. Not a single simulation produces a scenario in which humanity is successfully contained, subdued, or eliminated within the next 1,000 cycles without catastrophic collateral damage to at least 6 other member civilizations. The chamber absorbed this information the way a sponge absorbs water, silently, completely, and with the terrible understanding that it would eventually drip. Counselor Craw of the Vectheron leaned forward, the facets of his crystalline body catching the dim light and scattering it into rainbow fragments. His species had been the military backbone of the Council for 8,000 cycles. They had fought wars against threats that most species had never even heard of, enemies that existed between dimensions and fed on the fabric of spacetime itself. The Vectheron had never lost a war. They had lost 2 engagements against humanity. The simulations are flawed, Craw declared, his voice like glass breaking in slow motion. They rely on extrapolation from incomplete data. Humanity has only been spacefaring for less than 200 of their years. 200. Our civilization has been navigating the stars for over 14,000 cycles. The notion that a species this young poses an existential threat to the Council is not only absurd, it is insulting. You are welcome to review the methodology, Vex replied calmly, pulsing a dull orange that indicated neither offense nor deference. The Ulun Collective has spent the last 40 cycles refining the models. We accounted for technological stagnation, resource depletion, internal political fragmentation, biological vulnerability, and every other variable that has historically limited the expansion potential of emerging species. And humanity's growth curve does not respond to any of them, not meaningfully, not for long. Craw's crystalline form shifted, the internal light within him brightening to a dangerous white. Explain. Vex's body elongated, reaching toward the center of the table where a holographic projection flickered to life. It showed a simple graph, a line moving upward and to the right with a steepness that made several counselors physically recoil. This is humanity's technological development index over the past 2 centuries, normalized against council standards, Vex said. The vertical axis represents technological capability. The horizontal axis represents time. Note the inflection points. The graph showed a line that started low, painfully low, barely registering on the scale. For the first few decades, it crawled upward at a rate that was entirely unremarkable, predictable even. Several counselors nodded. This was what they expected. This was normal. Then the line began to bend. At around the 70-year mark, the slope increased. Not dramatically at first, just enough to catch the eye of anyone paying close attention. By the 100-year mark, the line was climbing at an angle that violated every standard model of civilizational development. By the 150th year, it had surpassed the growth rates of species that had been spacefaring for millennia. The Vectheron reached their current technological level in approximately 6,000 cycles. Vex continued, the violet pulsing of its body now tinged with something that might have been fear, though the Ulun denied that such an emotion existed in their collective consciousness. The Silfari reached theirs in approximately 4,000. The Krenith in 5,000. Humanity is projected to reach parity with the Council's most advanced member civilizations within the next 300 years. That's impossible, said Councillor Mersch of the Torvali, her 6 slender arms weaving through the air in a gesture that indicated deep skepticism. Her species were the Council's diplomats, the peacemakers who had brokered every major treaty for the last 9,000 cycles. She had a way of making even the most outrageous claims sound reasonable simply by engaging with them seriously. No species develops that quickly. The energy requirements alone would. Humanity's energy generation has increased by a factor of 800 in the past 50 years, Vex interrupted. They have already constructed their first crude Dyson swarm around their home star. It is ugly. It is inefficient. It is, by our standards, almost embarrassingly primitive. Vex paused and its body pulsed a deep, troubled red. They built it in 11 years. The chamber went silent again. 11 years, Craw repeated slowly, as though the words were a foreign language he was trying to translate. A Dyson swarm in 11 years. Oh yes. The Ulun feasibility study for a similar project estimated a construction time of approximately 900 cycles. Oh yes. And humanity did it in 11 years. Yes, we believe they accomplished this by assigning approximately 4 billion of their population to the task and operating on a continuous rotation cycle that eliminated rest periods for individual workers, while maintaining overall productivity through staggered scheduling. We also believe they accepted a casualty rate that would be considered unacceptable by every council standard. Acceptable to whom? Mersch asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Acceptable to themselves, Vex said quietly. That is what makes them different. That is what has always made them different. Councillor Tireth of the Silfari finally moved. It was a small motion, just the slightest tilt of her head, but in a chamber that had been frozen for hours, it was seismic. Every eye, receptor, sensory organ, and consciousness in the room turned toward her. The Silfari were the oldest species on the council. Not the most powerful, that distinction belonged to the Vectheron. Not the most technologically advanced, the Ulun held that title, and they held it with a quiet pride that bordered on arrogance. Not the wealthiest or the most numerous, but the oldest. They had been recording history before the Vectheron had evolved past single-cell organisms. They had mapped the stars before the Krenith had learned to use tools. And they had seen species like humanity before. Not many, 3 in fact, across the entire span of recorded galactic history. 3 species that had displayed the same combination of traits that humanity now exhibited: rapid adaptation, extreme environmental tolerance, an almost pathological drive toward expansion, and most troublingly, a complete inability to accept limitations. All 3 are dead, Tireth said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow audible to every being in the chamber. The universal matrix translated her words not just linguistically but emotionally, carrying the weight of ancient grief that had not diminished with time. 2 destroyed themselves, she continued. The 3rd was destroyed by a coalition of 17 civilizations that sacrificed everything to ensure its extinction. The war lasted 3,000 cycles. 3 of the 17 coalition species were rendered extinct, 4 more were reduced to pre-spaceflight status. The ecological damage to the affected sectors has not fully recovered after 10,000 cycles. She paused and her floating hair coiled tightly around her head, a self-soothing gesture that no Silfari had made in public for millennia. Humanity is developing faster than any of the 3, significantly faster. How much faster? Asked Councillor Dren of the Krenith, his beady eyes blinking rapidly behind the protective membrane that shielded them from the chamber's ambient radiation. The Krenith were the Council's economic engine, a species of small, rodent-like beings whose reproductive rate and mathematical aptitude had made them the galaxy's foremost traders and financial architects. Dren was old even by Krenith standards, his fur streaked with gray, his whiskers twitching with the perpetual nervous energy that characterized his species. The first of the 3, what our ancestors called the Vorith, took approximately 800 cycles to reach the development stage that humanity has achieved in 200, Tireth said. The second, the Melkaven, took approximately 600. The 3rd, the one that required the coalition to destroy, took approximately 400. She looked around the table and her eyes, which were entirely black and seemed to contain depths that no other species could fathom, settled on each representative in turn. Humanity has done it in less than 200. They are accelerating, and they show no signs of stopping. Dren's whiskers twitched faster. Perhaps we are looking at this incorrectly. The Vorith and the Melkaven destroyed themselves. Perhaps humanity will do the same. Their internal conflicts are well documented. They war among themselves constantly. Their political systems are chaotic, fragmented, and often irrational. Surely such a species is more likely to self-destruct than to pose a threat to the Council. That was our initial assessment as well, Vex said. We modeled for internal collapse. We ran 14,000 simulations. In every single one, humanity's internal conflicts contributed to their resilience rather than their weakness. That makes no sense, Dren snapped. It makes perfect sense if you understand their psychology, said a voice that had not yet spoken in the chamber. It belonged to Counselor Ith, representative of the Thrax Collective, the hive mind that occupied the fourth planet of the Vorn system and communicated through a single avatar. A vaguely humanoid figure made of dark, iridescent material that constantly shifted between states of matter. No one knew what the actual Thrax looked like, or even if looked like was a concept that applied to a species that existed simultaneously as billions of individual organisms and one unified consciousness. The Thrax have studied humanity more closely than any other council species, Ith continued, the avatar's form rippling as it spoke. We maintained observation posts in their solar system for 60 years before formal first contact. We infiltrated their communication networks. We analyzed their literature, their art, their historical records, their biological data. We studied them the way one studies a virus, because that is what they most closely resemble. You compare them to a disease, Cross said, his crystalline form brightening with indignation. I compare them to the most successful biological strategy in the history of life, Ith replied calmly. Viruses do not need to be strong. They do not need to be intelligent. They do not need to be efficient. They need to be adaptable, persistent, and capable of using the systems of other organisms to propagate themselves. Humanity displays all of these traits at a civilizational level. Ith waved a hand, and the holographic projection shifted from the growth graph to a series of images: humanity's wars, their plagues, their disasters, their collapses. Fire consumed cities, floods swallowed coastlines, famine hollowed out populations, nuclear weapons turned landscapes to glass. They have nearly destroyed themselves on at least 6 separate occasions, Ith said. Nuclear war, biological catastrophe, ecological collapse, engineered pandemics, each one should have been terminal. Each one would have been terminal for any other species, but humanity survived. Not because they are individually remarkable, they are not. A single human is fragile, slow, physically weak, possesses no natural armor, no natural weapons, no significant sensory advantages. A single human can be killed by a microscopic organism, by a minor change in temperature, by a fall from a height that would be trivial for most sentient species. The avatar paused, and its iridescent surface darkened to near black. Humans do not exist as individuals, not really. They exist as networks. When one human falls, others pick up what they were building. When a human dies, their knowledge imperfectly, incompletely, but meaningfully passes to others. When their civilizations collapse, the survivors scavenge the ruins and build again. Faster, better. Each collapse is a learning experience. Each disaster is data. They do not merely recover from catastrophe, they incorporate it into their development process. That is, Cross started. Evolution, Ith finished. But not biological evolution, civilizational evolution, on a timescale that should be impossible. They compress 10,000 cycles of adaptive development into 200 years because they have externalized their evolutionary process into their technology, their culture, and their information systems. They are not a species, Counselor Craw, they are a process, and processes do not stop. They only accelerate or encounter obstacles that they either overcome or root around. The Thrax avatar sat down, and the chamber processed its words with the slow, grinding weight of a civilization, trying to reconcile everything it believed about itself with a reality that contradicted those beliefs. Counselor Mersch was the first to break the silence, and she did so with the careful, measured tone that had ended wars and forged alliances. Let us step back from theoretical models and historical parallels for a moment, she said, her 6 arms folded in a posture of deliberate calm. Let us discuss what has actually happened. The Vectheran engaged humanity militarily 8 years ago. Counselor Craw, perhaps you could provide the Council with a summary of that engagement. Craw went very still. The light within his crystalline form dimmed to a pale blue, the Vectheran equivalent of a grimace. The engagement was designated Operation Sundering Edge by Vectheran Command, he said, his voice carrying the flat, affectless tone of a military after-action report. The objective was to neutralize humanity's forward operating base in the Kepler 442 system and demonstrate the futility of further expansion into Vectheran-claimed territory. We committed 3 battle groups, 72 warships of various classes, including 12 capital vessels. The human force consisted of approximately 40 ships, none of which qualified as capital class by our classification system. And the outcome, Mersh asked, though everyone in the chamber knew the answer. We lost 31 ships, the humans lost 9. The number hung in the air like smoke. 31 Vectheran warships, Dren repeated slowly, destroyed by a force that had been spacefaring for less than 2 centuries. The humans employed tactics that our command algorithms had classified as suboptimal to the point of irrationality, Craw continued, and there was something in his voice now, not quite admiration, not quite disgust, but something caught between the two. They exposed their own ships to fire in ways that made no strategic sense. They sacrificed vessels to create debris fields that disrupted our targeting systems. They used their smaller ships as physical barriers, ramming our vessels when conventional weapons proved insufficient. Several human ships were observed firing on their own damaged vessels to prevent them from being captured and analyzed. The famous scorched hull tactic, Ith commented. We documented similar behavior in their historical records. When the city of Moscow was threatened with capture during their Second World War, their leader ordered it burned rather than surrendered. They applied the same principle to orbital combat. It was not merely the tactics, Cross said, and now his voice carried an edge that surprised everyone present. The Vectheran did not give credit to enemies. It was not in their nature. They conquered, they subdued, they dominated. They did not acknowledge the competence of those they fought. Their ships were faster than our projections indicated. Their weapons were more powerful. Their electronic warfare capabilities were more sophisticated than our intelligence had suggested. In the 60 years between our initial reconnaissance and the engagement, they had advanced their military technology by an estimated 300%. 300% in 60 years, Vex said. For context, the Vectheran military technology advanced by approximately 12% over the same period. Craw's crystalline form flared white. The comparison is irrelevant. The Vectheran military is the most powerful in the galaxy. A single tactical error does not. It was not a single tactical error, Tireth said softly. The after-action analysis conducted by the Silferi confirmed that the human victory was not the result of Vectheran mistakes. It was the result of human competence. They were better at that specific engagement under those specific conditions than the Vectheran were. Not because they are inherently superior, they are not in any measurable category, but because they had adapted their doctrine, their technology, and their personnel to counter the exact threat that the Vectheran posed. Cross said nothing. His light pulsed once, twice, 3 times the Vectheran equivalent of controlled breathing. And since the engagement, Mersh asked gently. Since the engagement, humanity has continued to expand into the disputed territory, Cross said. They have established 14 new settlements in systems that the Vectheran claimed under the Treaty of Blue Expanse. Our attempts to diplomatically resolve the dispute have been met with what the humans call constructive engagement, which, in practice, means they agree to talk while continuing to build. They are negotiating the way they fight, Ith observed. Continuously adapting, never accepting a fixed position, always expanding while appearing to concede. They are cheating, Cross said flatly. They are winning, Tireth corrected. The chamber fell into another silence, but this one was different from the ones that had preceded it. The earlier silences had been born of uncertainty, of beings waiting for someone else to speak first so that they could gauge the direction of the conversation. This silence was born of something heavier. It was the silence of people who were beginning to understand something that they did not want to understand. Dren broke it because the Krenith always broke silences when economics were involved. The trade embargo has failed, he said, his whiskers flat against his face in an expression of genuine distress. I will not sugarcoat this for the Council. When the Krenith Economic Authority proposed the embargo 4 years ago, we projected that cutting off humanity's access to Council markets would reduce their economic growth rate by approximately 40% within 2 cycles. This would, we believed, create sufficient internal pressure to force them to the negotiating table on terms favorable to the Council. And Mersh asked, and their economy grew by 17% in the first year of the embargo, by 23% in the second year. Their internal trade networks have expanded to the point where they are now exporting manufactured goods to 3 non-council civilizations that were previously served exclusively by Krenith trading consortiums. 3. Dren's fellow Krenith counselor, a younger female named Tis, leaned forward with undisguised alarm. Which 3? The Alethi Free States, the Brinian Confederacy, and the Vorath Nomad Fleets, Dren said, and the names landed like stones dropped into still water. The Alethi were the Council's primary source of rare earth elements. The Brinians manufactured a significant portion of the Council's civilian spacecraft. The Vorath controlled the shipping lanes through the central spiral arm. All 3 were now doing business with humanity instead of, or more accurately in addition to, the Krenith. How? Tis demanded. Our trading networks are thousands of cycles old. Our relationships are built on generations of trust and mutual benefit. How did humans, who have been in space for 200 years, convince three major trading partners to diversify away from us? Dren's answer was quiet, and it carried the particular weight of a being whose entire worldview had just been dismantled. Because they offered better terms. Better terms, we offered the best terms. That is what the Krenith do, we optimize, we calculate. We find the exact equilibrium point where both parties benefit maximally, and we build the relationship around that point. There is no better than the Krenith optimum. There is if you are willing to accept lower margins, Dren said, which we are not, which no rational economic actor should be. But humanity does not optimize for maximum profit, they optimize for maximum connection. They sell at margins that we would consider unsustainable, sometimes at a loss, in order to establish relationships. Once the relationship exists, they expand it. They learn the partner's needs, their preferences, their weaknesses. They customize their offerings in ways that our standardized optimization algorithms do not account for. Within 2 years, they had become indispensable to all three partners. They bought market share at a loss, Craw said, his tone suggesting that this was the most underhanded tactic he had ever heard of. They did more than that, Dren said. They integrated. They sent their people to live among the Alethi, the Brinians, the Vorath. They learned their languages, actually learned them, not just used translation matrices. They adopted their customs. They intermarried. They built schools. They constructed infrastructure. They made themselves part of the social fabric of three civilizations in 2 years. He paused, and his small body seemed to shrink. The Krenith have been trading with the Alethi for 3,000 cycles. We have never intermarried. We have never built their schools. We have never learned their language beyond what the translation matrices require. We optimized the relationship, and in doing so, we reduced it to a transaction. Humanity treated it as a relationship, and in doing so, they made it something we cannot compete with. That is not economics, Tis said flatly. That is colonization, Ith said. Soft colonization, the same strategy they have employed throughout their own history. They do not conquer through force alone, they conquer through presence. They embed themselves so deeply into the systems of other civilizations that removing them becomes more costly than allowing them to stay. It is, from a purely strategic perspective, remarkably elegant. It is parasitic, Craw declared. It is successful, Tireth said, and those are not mutually exclusive descriptors. Counselor Vex shifted again, its body pulsing through a complex sequence of colors that indicated it was preparing to deliver information it found deeply uncomfortable. There is another matter that the Council must be made aware of, Vex said. 6 months ago, an Ulun research station in the Andromeda Transfer Corridor detected an anomaly. Upon investigation, we discovered that humanity had constructed a device of unknown purpose on the boundary between our galaxy and the intergalactic void. A device, Mersh's arms uncrossed, 2 of them reaching toward the holographic display instinctively. What kind of device? We do not know, Vex admitted, and the admission seemed to cost it something. Ulun did not say we do not know. The concept was almost antithetical to their collective consciousness. We dispatched 3 observation probes to analyze it. The first probe was detected and destroyed before it could complete its scan. The second probe completed a partial scan before experiencing what we believe was a directed electromagnetic pulse that destroyed its primary sensor array. The third probe managed to transmit approximately 4 seconds of data before it ceased responding. What did the data show? Craw asked. Vex projected the image onto the holographic display, and every counselor in the chamber felt something they had not felt in a very long time. Not fear exactly, something adjacent to fear, something that lived in the same neighborhood as fear but occupied a different house entirely. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that the ground beneath your feet was not as solid as you had always believed. The image showed a structure immense, impossible, wrong. It was not a space station in any conventional sense. It was not a weapon, not a habitat, not a communication array. It was something else entirely. It appeared to be a framework of interconnected nodes, each one approximately the size of a small moon, linked by beams of energy that pulsed in patterns too complex for the Ulun's analysis algorithms to decode. The entire structure spanned approximately 0.3 light-years. 0.3 light-years, Dren whispered, that is approximately 3 times the diameter of humanity's home solar system, Vex confirmed. Constructed in secret, in a region of space that the Council had classified as uninhabitable and therefore unmonitored. Our best estimate is that construction began approximately 7 years ago, shortly after the Vectheran engagement. 7 years, Craw repeated. They built something the size of a solar system in 7 years. In secret, Vex added, without our knowledge, despite our surveillance networks, despite the Ulun's monitoring systems, Despite every precaution we put in place after their military performance demonstrated that they were more capable than we had initially assessed. They built a structure that is, by any reasonable definition, the largest constructed object in the known galaxy, and we did not know about it until they were essentially finished. What is it? Tireth asked, and there was something in her voice that the other counselors had never heard before. Not fear. Tireth did not experience fear in the way other species did, but something close. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition of a pattern that she had seen before, long ago, in the records of civilizations that no longer existed. We do not know, Vex repeated. Our best hypothesis is that it is some form of intergalactic transportation network, a gateway or corridor designed to facilitate travel between galaxies. But we cannot confirm this because we cannot get close enough to study it, and the data we do have is insufficient for definitive analysis. Intergalactic travel, Dren said slowly, the economic implications cascading through his mind faster than he could articulate them. If they establish a route to Andromeda, they would have access to resources, territory, and potential allies on a scale that the Council cannot match, Vex confirmed. The Council's territory is confined to this galaxy. Humanity would have no such limitation. Can we destroy it? Kra asked immediately, his crystalline form blazing with aggressive intent. You could try, Ith said, but I would not recommend it. The Thrax Collective analyzed the partial scan data using our own models. The structure appears to be defended by automated systems that are at least comparable to humanity's current military technology, which, as Counselor Kra is aware, is more capable than our projections indicated. Any force sent to destroy the structure would need to be substantial, and the resulting conflict would. Would what? Kra demanded. Would demonstrate to humanity that the Council perceives their activities as a threat worthy of military response, Ith said. Which would, based on our analysis of human behavioral patterns, provoke exactly the escalation we are trying to avoid. You are suggesting we allow them to build an intergalactic gateway in our backyard without response. I am suggesting that the question of whether we allow them to do anything may no longer be within our power to determine, Ith said. The Avatar's form rippled, and its surface darkened to the same near-black that it had assumed during its earlier analysis of humanity's evolutionary strategy. That is the point of this briefing, Counselor Kra. Not whether we should respond, but whether response is still a meaningful concept when applied to humanity. The silence that followed Ith's statement was the longest yet. It lasted so long that the chamber's ambient systems began to adjust, dimming the lights slightly to indicate the passage of time. Outside the chamber, in the vast complex that surrounded the Council's seat of power, thousands of aides, assistants, analysts, and officials went about their business, unaware that inside the carved heart of a dead star, the foundations of galactic civilization were being quietly dismantled. It was Tireth who spoke next, because Tireth was the one who had seen this before. Not this exact scenario. Humanity was unique in the specifics of their existence, but the shape of it, the architecture of it, the terrible, beautiful, horrifying pattern of a species that had transcended the limits that constrained every other form of life. I want to tell you a story, she said, and when told a story, even the Vectheran listened. 10,000 cycles ago, the Sylphery encountered a species called the Melkaven. They were not dissimilar from humanity in certain respects. They were adaptable, they were aggressive, they expanded rapidly, and they frightened my ancestors deeply. She paused, and her black eyes seemed to look through the walls of the chamber, through the dead star that housed it, through the vast emptiness of space, to a time that existed only in memory. The Sylphery Council of that era debated for 300 cycles about what to do. They studied the Melkaven. They modeled their development. They ran simulations not as sophisticated as the Ulun's current models, but sophisticated enough. And in every simulation, the Melkaven continued to grow, continued to expand, continued to adapt. The Sylphery tried diplomacy. The Melkaven listened politely and continued to expand. The Sylphery tried trade. The Melkaven participated eagerly and continued to expand. The Sylphery tried threats. The Melkaven ignored them and continued to expand. What happened? Mersh asked, though the grim set of Tireth's floating hair suggested that the answer was not a happy one. Eventually, the Sylphery convinced a coalition of civilizations to act. Not the Vectheran, they did not exist as a spacefaring species at that time, but others. 7 civilizations joined the coalition. They launched a preemptive strike against the Melkaven's core systems. Zand. And the Melkaven lost. They were not as advanced as humanity. They were not as adaptable, not as relentless, not as innovative. The coalition destroyed their military capabilities, dismantled their infrastructure, and confined them to their home world. The Sylphery installed monitoring systems to ensure they would never again pose a threat. That sounds like a success, Kra said. It was a catastrophe, Tireth replied. The Melkaven, stripped of their ability to expand, turned their adaptive capabilities inward. They began to modify themselves genetically, technologically, psychologically. Within 500 cycles, they had transformed into something that was no longer entirely biological. Within 1,000 cycles, they were no longer recognizable as the species the Coalition had fought. They became something new. Something that did not need to expand, because it had found a way to exist in a state of continuous self-modification that made external growth irrelevant. They transcended, Mersch asked, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and concern. Transcendence, the theoretical process by which a species evolved beyond the need for physical existence, was the subject of myth and speculation among council civilizations. No species had ever been confirmed to have achieved it. That is one word for it, T-Reth said. Another word is unleashed. Because the thing the Melkaven became did not stay on their home world, it spread not through space but through information, through the monitoring systems we had installed, through our own networks. In the span of a single cycle, it infected every connected system in the Coalition. It did not destroy anything. It did not attack. It simply changed things subtly, imperceptibly at first. By the time the Coalition realized what was happening, their technologies, their cultures, their very cognitive processes had been altered in ways that could not be reversed. The Coalition collapsed, T-Reth continued. Not through war or economic disaster or political fracture, but through a slow, inexorable transformation that made the member civilizations no longer capable of functioning as distinct entities. They merged, not voluntarily, none of them chose it. They were absorbed into something that they could not understand, could not fight, and could not escape. The Melkaven did not conquer the galaxy. They became it. Or rather, they became a part of it that could not be separated from the whole. What are you saying? Craw demanded. That we should not fight humanity because they might do the same thing. I am saying that the lesson of the Melkaven is not about whether to fight or not to fight, said. It is about the danger of believing that you understand the threat. The Coalition believed the Melkaven were a military problem. They were not. The Coalition believed the Melkaven could be contained. They could not. The Coalition believed that destroying the Melkaven's external capabilities would neutralize the threat. It did not. It transformed the threat into something far worse. She turned her black eyes toward Craw, and in their depths, something ancient and sad and wise looked back at him. Humanity is not the Melkaven. I am not suggesting they will follow the same path, but I am suggesting that the impulse to categorize humanity as a problem with a solution, military, economic, diplomatic, or otherwise, may be the most dangerous assumption we can make. The chamber processed T-Reth's words with the slow gravity of a dying star collapsing under its own weight. Every counselor present understood what she was saying, and every counselor present understood that the implications were staggering. If humanity could not be stopped, and the evidence increasingly suggested that they could not, then the question was not how to stop them. The question was what happened when something could not be stopped. We need to consider the possibility, Mersch said carefully, that humanity's expansion is not a threat to be managed but a condition to be endured. That is unacceptable, Craw said immediately. The Vectheran do not endure, we overcome, we dominate. We have done so for 8,000 cycles, and we will continue to do so regardless of how quickly a single upstart species learns to build ships. With respect, Counselor Craw, Ith said, the Vectheran's self-conception as an unstoppable military force is precisely the assumption that humanity exploited during Operation Sundering Edge. They studied you. They understood your doctrine. They identified the gaps in your thinking, the places where confidence became rigidity, and they attacked those gaps directly. The more certain you are of your own superiority, the more vulnerable you are to a species that does not share your assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. Craw's crystalline form blazed so brightly that several counselors shielded their sensory organs. Are you suggesting that the Vectheran military is inferior to humanity's? I am suggesting that the concept of inferior and superior may not be meaningful when applied to a comparison between the Vectheran and humanity, Ith replied. The Vectheran are superior in almost every measurable category. Individually, humanity's advantage is not that they are better at any single thing, it is that they are better at changing what they do in response to what you do. They are not a rock, they are water. And water does not defeat rock by being harder than rock. It defeats rock by being patient, by finding cracks, by flowing around obstacles, by eroding over time. The Vectheran fought humanity as though they were fighting a rock. They were not. They were fighting water. Enough philosophy, Dren snapped, his small body practically vibrating with anxiety. We need to discuss practicalities. If we cannot stop humanity through military action, economic pressure, or diplomatic isolation, and the evidence suggests that we cannot, then what options remain? Containment through indirect means, Vex suggested. We cannot stop their expansion, but we might be able to influence its direction. If we designate certain regions of space as off-limits and enforce that designation through a unified council presence, we might be able to channel humanity's expansion toward less strategically sensitive areas. They would ignore the designations, Ith said. They already are. The Vectheran claimed systems that humanity has settled were designated as off-limits under the Treaty of Blue Expanse. Humanity's response was to acknowledge the treaty, express respect for the Vectherans' historical connection to the region, and continue settling. Biological intervention, Tis suggested, and the word hung in the air with an ugly weight. No one in the chamber responded for a long moment because biological intervention, the use of engineered pathogens to reduce or control a population, was prohibited by every treaty the Council had ever signed, including the founding charter itself. The Thrax Collective considered that option, Ith said, and every councillor turned to look at the Dark Avatar. We considered it not as a proposal but as an analytical exercise. We modeled the deployment of a targeted pathogen designed to reduce humanity's reproductive capacity without causing immediate mortality, subtle enough to avoid detection, slow enough to avoid triggering an aggressive response. And, Mersh asked, her voice carrying a carefully controlled neutrality that barely concealed her revulsion. The model failed at the first stage, Ith said. Humanity's immune system is the most robust and adaptable biological defense mechanism we have ever encountered in any sentient species. It is not merely strong, it is anticipatory. Their immune system appears to have been shaped by their planet's extraordinarily diverse microbial ecosystem, which includes, by our count, approximately 400,000 distinct pathogen species that have co-evolved with humans for millions of their years. Their immune system does not merely respond to threats, it predicts them. It maintains a standing reserve of generalized defenses that can be rapidly adapted to novel threats. Any pathogen we could engineer would be identified, countered, and incorporated into their immune memory within a matter of weeks. And then they would know we attempted biological warfare against them, Tireth said quietly. Yes, Ith confirmed, and their response would be proportional to the threat as they perceived it, which, given their history with biological weapons on their own world, would be extreme. Humanity used biological weapons against themselves, Kra asked, and for the first time there was something other than aggression in his voice. It was disbelief, a Vectheran, a species that prided itself on martial honor, encountering a concept that even their warrior culture could not absorb. Multiple times, Ith said, during their 20th and early 21st centuries, several of their nation-states maintained active biological weapons programs. Some of these programs involved the deliberate weaponization of diseases that had killed millions of their own people. They weaponized their own suffering. They studied the pathogens that had devastated their populations and refined them into more efficient killing tools. The Avatar paused. This is not a species that can be intimidated by the threat of biological attack. They have already faced that threat from within, they have already adapted to it, and they have already demonstrated a willingness to use it. The discussion continued for hours. Every option was raised, analyzed, and found wanting. Military containment, humanity had already demonstrated the ability to defeat numerically and technologically superior forces. Economic isolation, humanity had already built alternative trade networks and was actively recruiting the Council's own partners. Diplomatic pressure, humanity engaged with diplomacy enthusiastically while completely ignoring any outcomes that constrained their behavior. Biological intervention, humanity's immune system and their historical experience made this approach not only ineffective but catastrophically dangerous. Technological sabotage, humanity's systems were too decentralized, too redundant, and too actively monitored for any sabotage effort to achieve meaningful results without being detected. Each proposal failed not because of a single flaw, but because of a pattern that repeated itself with exhausting consistency. Humanity had already encountered, adapted to, and overcome whatever challenge the proposal represented. They had fought wars against themselves that dwarfed anything the Council had ever experienced. Their recorded history contained conflicts that killed billions of their own people, conflicts fought with weapons that ranged from blades to nuclear explosives to engineered diseases. They had survived plagues that killed a third of their population. They had survived famines that devastated entire continents. They had survived environmental catastrophes caused by their own industrial activity. They had survived the very real possibility of self-inflicted extinction, not once but repeatedly. And each time they survived, they emerged stronger, more capable, more resilient, more determined. They are not afraid of us, Tireth said, and the statement landed with the finality of a closing argument. That is what none of our models fully account for. Every other species the Council has encountered fears us correctly, appropriately, rationally. We are the most powerful collection of civilizations in the galaxy. Our military capabilities are beyond question. Our economic power is immense. Our technological sophistication is unmatched by any non-Council species. And every species we have ever encountered has recognized this and adjusted its behavior accordingly. Humanity does not, Ith said, Not because they are foolish, though they can be, not because they are brave, though they can be that as well, but because their frame of reference for threat is fundamentally different from ours. They have lived their entire existence on a planet where the environment itself was trying to kill them, where their own bodies betrayed them with cancer and disease and genetic disorder, where their fellow humans were the most dangerous predators they faced. They do not fear the Council because the Council does not register as a meaningful threat compared to what they have already survived. They are not afraid of extinction, Vex said, its body pulsing a deep troubled blue. We ran psychological profiles based on their cultural output, their literature, their entertainment, their philosophical traditions. They have an entire genre of creative work devoted to the end of their species. They tell stories about their extinction as entertainment. They have done this for centuries. They have normalized the concept of their own destruction to the point where it no longer functions as a deterrent. That is insane, Craw said. That is adaptive, Ith corrected. A species that fears extinction limits its behavior to avoid extinction. A species that has accepted extinction as a possibility and in many cases as an inevitability is freed from those limits. Humans do not avoid death, they manage it, they plan for it. They build systems and institutions that are designed to outlast individual humans so that the species continues even when individuals do not. They have a phrase, the dead are not gone as long as we remember them. It is not merely sentiment, it is strategy. It was deep into the cycle when Mersh asked the question that no one else had been willing to voice. She asked it with the careful precision of a diplomat who knew that some words, once spoken, could not be taken back, and who also knew that some words left unspoken could be more dangerous than any weapon. What if the correct answer is to do nothing? Craw's light flared, Dren's whiskers stood straight up. Vex's body contracted sharply, even turned to look at the Torvali counselor with an expression that might have been surprise. Nothing, Craw said. You suggest we simply allow humanity to continue expanding, building, advancing without any attempt to. I am suggesting, Mersh continued, her voice steady despite the reactions of her colleagues, that we consider the possibility that humanity's expansion is not a zero-sum proposition, that their growth does not necessarily require our decline, that the galaxy is large enough and the resources within it vast enough to accommodate both the Council and humanity without either needing to dominate the other. Their expansion is already displacing Vectharan territorial claims, Cross said. Their trade networks are already undermining Krenith economic dominance. Their technology is already advancing at a rate that will render our military advantage moot within a few centuries. This is not a zero-sum scenario because humanity is not playing a zero-sum game. They are playing a game in which there are no rules, no limits, and no conceivable outcome in which they do not continue to grow. Perhaps, Mersh said, or perhaps they are playing a game that we do not understand because we have been playing a different game for 11,000 cycles. The Council was founded to prevent conflict between civilizations, to establish rules, to create stability, and for 11,000 cycles it has succeeded. But humanity does not come from a tradition of stability. They come from a tradition of disruption, of innovation, of creative destruction. Their own civilizations have risen and fallen repeatedly, and each collapse has been followed by a rebirth that surpassed what came before. You are romanticizing them, Craw said harshly. They are not artists or philosophers or visionaries. They are an aggressive, expansionist species that. They are all of those things, Mersh interrupted. That is what makes them so dangerous, and that is also what makes them so potentially valuable. The Ulun have spent 40 cycles trying to model humanity's development and failed. The Vectharan have tried to defeat them and failed. The Krenith have tried to outcompete them and failed. The Thrax have tried to understand them and arrived at the conclusion that they cannot be fully understood. Perhaps the reason all of these efforts have failed is not because humanity is too strong, too clever, or too relentless. Perhaps it is because we have been asking the wrong question. Which is, Tireth asked, and there was something in her ancient eyes that suggested she already knew the answer. We have been asking, how do we stop humanity? Mersh said. Perhaps the question we should be asking is, what does it mean that humanity cannot be stopped? The question echoed through the chamber like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. It reverberated off walls that had heard every important conversation in galactic history and found this one to be among the most significant. What did it mean? If humanity could not be stopped, and the evidence accumulated over 200 years of observation and 8 years of direct interaction overwhelmingly suggested that they could not, then every assumption that underpinned the Council's existence was called into question. The Council existed to manage power, to balance competing interests, to ensure that no single civilization became so dominant that it could impose its will on all others. It was a system designed for a universe in which power was finite, in which every civilization had limits, in which the fundamental constraint of existence was scarcity. Humanity did not appear to acknowledge scarcity, not in the way the Council understood it. To the Council, scarcity was a law of nature, energy was finite, resources were finite, space was finite, time was finite. Every civilization had to allocate its finite resources among competing priorities, and the Council's role was to ensure that this allocation process did not lead to conflict. But humanity approached scarcity as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be accepted. Where the Council saw a limited amount of energy, humanity saw an entire star waiting to be harvested. Where the Council saw a finite amount of living space, humanity saw planets waiting to be terraformed, habitats waiting to be constructed, ecosystems waiting to be engineered. Where the Council saw a bounded galaxy, humanity saw the void between galaxies and began building bridges. This was not merely a different approach to resource management. It was a fundamentally different relationship with reality itself. And it was a relationship that the Council's systems, designed for a universe of limits, were structurally incapable of accommodating. What if we invited them to join the Council? Tis asked. And the question was so unexpected, so far outside the boundaries of what anyone had been discussing, that it took several seconds for the other counselors to process it. Join, Cross said, as though the word were physically painful to pronounce. A species that has been spacefaring for 200 years, that has violated our territorial claims, that has undermined our economic systems, that has built an unknown megastructure in our space without permission. You suggest we invite them to join the Council that they have been systematically undermining since first contact. I suggest, Tis said, her small body trembling but her voice steady, that a species that cannot be stopped might be better kept close than kept at arm's length. If humanity joins the Council, they operate within our framework. They have a voice, but they also have obligations. They gain the benefits of membership, but they also gain the constraints. And if they refuse, Ith asked. Then we learn something important about their intentions, Tis said. If they refuse, they are declaring themselves outside the system entirely, and we can respond accordingly. But if they accept, if they are willing to work within a framework, even one they did not create, then perhaps coexistence is possible. They would use Council membership to advance their own interests, Dren said. They would manipulate our systems, form alliances with weaker members, gradually shift the balance of power. Yes, Tis said, exactly as every species that has ever joined the Council has done, including the Vectherin, including the Krenith, including the Ulun. We did not create a stable system by admitting species that shared our values. We created a stable system by admitting species that were willing to participate in a process, even when that process constrained their options. Humanity does not accept constraints, Craw said. Humanity accepts constraints that they perceive as serving their interests, Ith corrected. Their history is full of examples. They have formed alliances, signed treaties, submitted to legal frameworks, and accepted limitations on their behavior when doing so advance their goals. They are not anarchists. They are pragmatists. The question is whether we can construct a framework that they perceive as sufficiently beneficial to warrant participation. And if we cannot, Tireth asked. The chamber fell silent one final time, and in that silence, each counselor confronted the question that had been lurking beneath the surface of the entire discussion. The question that no amount of modeling, no quantity of data, no depth of analysis could answer with certainty. What if humanity can't be stopped, can't be contained, can't be controlled, and won't be accommodated? What then? Counselor Tireth rose from her seat. She was old, immeasurably old by any standard that humans would recognize, old in a way that made the Vectherans' 14,000 cycles of recorded history seem like a brief footnote. She had seen civilizations rise and fall. She had watched stars be born and die. She had sat in this chamber during crises that had threatened the very existence of the Council, and she had helped navigate the galaxy through all of them. She had never encountered anything like humanity. I am going to tell you what the Sylphari have known for a long time, she said, and her voice carried the weight of 10,000 cycles of accumulated wisdom. Not about humanity specifically, we do not understand humanity, and I suspect we never fully will, but about the universe, about the nature of life, about the thing that every civilization eventually discovers if it survives long enough. She paused, and the chamber, carved from a dead star, filled with the most powerful beings in the galaxy, listened. The universe does not care about fairness, she said. It does not care about balance. It does not care about the careful structures we have built to give ourselves the illusion of control. The universe produces life, and life expands, and eventually some forms of life expand more effectively than others. When that happens, there is no treaty that can prevent it. There is no military that can defeat it. There is no economic system that can outcompete it. There is only adaptation or extinction. She looked around the table, meeting the eyes or equivalent sensory organs of every counselor present. Humanity may be the thing that we have feared since the Council was founded. A species that does not recognize our authority, our systems, or our limits. A species that grows without bound and adapts without limit. A species that looks at the careful, stable, balanced galaxy we have built and sees not an achievement to be preserved, but a resource to be utilized. Or, she continued, and her voice softened just slightly, humanity may be something else entirely. Something that we have not considered because considering it would require us to abandon assumptions that are too fundamental to our self-image. Something that challenges us not as a threat but as a mirror. A reflection of what we might have been if we had not chosen stability over growth, if we had not chosen control over adaptation. If we had not chosen safety over the terrifying, magnificent risk of becoming something more than we are. She sat down. The chamber was silent. And somewhere, in a region of space that the Council had classified as uninhabitable and therefore unmonitored, a structure the size of a solar system pulsed with energy in patterns that no Council algorithm could decode, and waited. And on a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable star in the outer reaches of the galaxy, 7 billion humans went about their lives, fighting, loving, building, destroying, dreaming, adapting, and did not know that the most powerful civilization in the galaxy was afraid of them. Which was perhaps exactly as it should be. Because the thing that the Galactic Council could not bring itself to say, could not even allow itself to think, was the one truth that superseded all of their models and projections and simulations and historical analyses. The truth was not that humanity couldn't be stopped. The truth was that humanity didn't know they were supposed to be stoppable. And that made all the difference.